The Indian Ocean is one of the most strategic seas on the globe. So much so that Alfred Mahan, perhaps the United States' most influential strategic thinker, famously declared that whoever controls the Indian Ocean will dominate Asia. This is because the Indian Ocean connects 5 continents: Africa, Antarctica, Asia, Oceania, and Europe. A significant portion of the world's busiest sea lines of communication, SLOCs in short, pass through the Indian Ocean. These SLOCs not only facilitate the movement of warships from one theater to another, but they also enable the navigation of commercial vessels that transport the appliances we use daily and the energy sources that power them. In fact, chances are that this very video is being streamed through an underwater internet cable laid beneath one of these SLOCs. India occupies a strategic position on the Indian Ocean region, IOR, as it sits between its main bottlenecks. To the west, the Straits of Hormuz and Bab el-Mandeb are essential for the trade of oil products and merchandise. To the south, between the Lakshadweep and Maldives archipelagos, lies the so-called 8-degree channel, which serves as a bottleneck for SLOCs connecting Europe, Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. Finally, to the east, through the Andaman and Nicobar archipelago, India controls the western gateway into the Malacca Strait, the main connection point between the Indian and Pacific Oceans. This last one is of particular importance in the possible confrontation between the US and China. In the event of an unlikely invasion of Taiwan, the Malacca Strait will be one of the first regions to see a flare-up in tensions. In many ways, India's foreign policy is embodied by the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, which sit at the root of its Malacca dilemma. Should India enter the conflict between China and the United States? And if so, on whose side should it stand? As we'll see further in the video, India's strategic location in the IOR, coupled with its control of the Malacca Strait, gives it the potential to shape the geopolitical landscape of their region. If, on the surface, it appears that New Delhi is attempting to maintain a neutral position between 2 contenders, joining the Quad against China, while supporting Mauritius's claims over Diego Garcia against the US. In reality, however, India is quite pragmatic in deciding which side to take. But to understand India's role, we first need to understand the importance of these islands for both China and the US, especially in view of a possible confrontation. There are 3 main factors that explain why these islands are so strategic for both countries: trade, oil product supplies, and force projection. From Japan to China, the majority of Asia's economies are dependent on sea trade. The World's Bank estimate that for China and Japan, trade accounts for 37% of their GDP, and for Korea, that spikes up to 80%. The lion's share of this traffic hinges on navigation through the Malacca Strait. 50% of global and 40% of China's sea trade steam through the Malacca Strait each year. This reliance is even greater for oil and gas imports, which are essential in the energy production and transportation sectors. About 60% of Beijing's total crude oil consumption pass through the Malacca or Sunda Straits. Similarly, South Korea and Japan import close to 80 and 90%, respectively, of crude oil from the west of the Malacca Strait. The US also depends on the Malacca Strait. If Beijing relies on this choke point for its own economy and energy supplies, Washington needs the Malacca Strait transit to supply its allies in the region. In the last decade, the United States has become the world's top oil and gas producer, thanks to the economization of shale deposits. This means that US allies in the region now depend on US oil. South Korea and Taiwan import around 12 and 16% of crude oil from the US, while Japan imports 16.3% of gas. The majority of US oil production happens in the Gulf of Mexico, meaning that tankers take the Indo-Atlantic route, relying on the passage on the Malacca Strait. The protection of trade and oil supply lines is of paramount importance to both China and the United States. As such, both countries value the ability to project force in the Indian Ocean region, the IOR. In the case of a conflict, China's interests would be to protect its supply lines while denying those of US allies such as Taiwan and Japan, and vice versa for America. To this end, maintaining a stable presence close to strategic choke points, which are the most efficient access denial points, is a sound strategy for both countries. On one side, Washington has the widest network of overseas bases in the world. In the Indian Ocean region alone, it has bases in close proximity to almost all of the critical bottlenecks. The Fifth Fleet home port in Bahrain, sitting close to the Hormuz Strait. Camp Lemonnier in Djibouti, being less than 100 miles from the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. Diego Garcia at one end of the 8-degree channel, in Lakshadweep, Maldives, Chagos island chain. And Chani, base in Singapore, right in front of the narrowest point in the Malacca Strait. U.S. allies also control other choke points, such as Australia's Keelings Islands, which increase maritime awareness in the southwestern part of the Indonesian Straits. Like the U.S., China is developing a network of overseas bases in the Indo-Pacific, referred to as strategic strongpoints. In 2017, the PLA created its first logistical base in Djibouti, which became fully operational in late March 2022, hosting the first port call of a planned supply vessel. Other overseas bases are being discussed with a focus on sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, the Indian Ocean region, and Southeast Asia. The most likely candidate is the Ream Naval Base in Cambodia, which is situated 640 miles from the Malacca Strait, around half the distance from the Hainan Island, where the majority of the planned Southern Fleet is headquartered. From a Chinese perspective, it is important to maintain its supplies passing through the Malacca Strait, while potentially disrupting those bound for Taiwan and Japan. From Washington's standpoint, the Malacca Strait is a strategic point in the event of a confrontation with China. In the case of an invasion on Taiwan, they could easily disrupt 60% of Chinese crude oil consumption. So why is India so important in all of this? Geographically speaking, India's Andaman and Nicobar archipelagos form a barrier between the Andaman Sea and the Indian Ocean, effectively holding the keys to the Malacca Strait's western entrance. Comprising of 572 islands with only 5% of them inhabited, these stretch for 850 kilometers from north to south, forming a maritime border with Myanmar, Thailand, and Indonesia. Strategically speaking, they act as a lid on the Malacca pot. In fact, there are only 3 international water and airspace corridors out of the Andaman Sea. The largest is the so-called 6th-degree channel, to the south, spanning less than 100 miles between Indira Point, India's southernmost land, and Rondo Island, north of the troubled Aceh province, in the northern part of the Indonesian island of Sumatra. This is the main corridor through which pass the majority of sloughs connecting Asia with Africa, Europe, and the Middle East. The other 2 passages to the north form the so-called Prepres Channel, which is a shallower access point into the Andaman Sea, with an average depth of around 250 meters. The first corridor is about 30 miles across, and lies between Myanmar's Koko and Prepres Islands, while the second one, between Prepres and the southern mainland Myanmar, measures around 83 miles. And, by the way, let me open a quick parenthesis here. This strategic location is also one of the reasons why the proposed Kra Canal project through Thailand would only be a partial solution to the Chinese Malacca dilemma, as the Nicobar and Andaman Islands could still create a potential blockade. The 2 archipelagos are in many ways the symbol of New Delhi's maritime strategy, pivoting between the Pacific and Indian Oceans, between China and the US. India's first and only tri-service command is the Andaman and Nicobar Command, headquartered in Port Blair since 2001, which apparently was also under surveillance of Chinese spy balloons back in January 2022. If a conflict were to happen between China and the US, which side would India take? Evidence would suggest the United States. India's interests is first and foremost to maintain its territorial unity and keep its political influence predominant in South Asia, which starkly contrapose it against China. India and China have had a long history of border disputes, most notably in 1962, where India lost the Aksai region to China. Additionally, China's attempts to challenge the status quo in India's backyard, such as the Gulf of Bengal, the Maldives, and Pakistan, are seen as a direct threat to India. China has also encroached on India through the infamous String of Pearls and by developing military ties with 3 of India's neighbors: Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Myanmar. According to the SIPRI data, these 3 countries are the main recipients of Chinese military exports, including missiles and submarines. In contrast, India does not perceive the same level of threat from the US. There are no territorial disputes between the 2 countries, and they are geographically far apart enough that their core interests are not in conflict. In fact, the US and India rely on each other in many ways. The US uses India's political influence to project its own agenda in South Asia, while India uses the US Navy and its close allies, such as Japan and Australia, to guarantee maritime security in the Indian Ocean region. So if an invasion of Taiwan were to happen, or the US-China confrontation were to escalate into a conflict, what would be these islands' roles? Strategically, these islands play 3 important roles. First, they act as an outpost to improve maritime awareness for India and its Quad allies, as demonstrated by the annual US Indo-Japanese Malabar exercise. It is highly probable that ASEAN members would maintain a neutral stance in case of a US-China conflict. Therefore, military ships and aircraft traveling from the Pacific to the Indian Ocean would be forced through the 3 international corridors in the Andaman Sea. India could easily install hydrophones and radar to control the surrounding air and sea spaces. Second, they serve as a forward operating base for India's deterrence capabilities. The central Andaman Sea creates a pocket almost 4,000 meters, or 12,000 feet deep, where India can advantageously deploy its submarines. On the one hand, New Delhi can maintain its nuclear-powered submarines armed with ballistic missiles, creating a realistic deterrence capability closer to the Pacific Ocean. On the other hand, the Andaman Sea is the perfect spot to deploy area denial capabilities. Part of India's diesel attack submarines could operate directly from the Andaman, instead of the Visakhapatnam naval base on the Gulf of Bengal. Without the need to travel longer distances, these submarines would rely on less refueling, extending their operational time. As the northern part of the Andaman Sea is also much shallower, less than 600 feet, it makes it riskier for enemy submarines to pass through here and funnel them along India's controlled areas, creating a formidable tiger den. Third, the Andaman and Nicobar Islands are the springboard for expanding India's strategic space towards the western Pacific Ocean and Southeast Asia. The archipelagos connect India directly with the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN. Though China is by far the association's main trade partner, accounting for 22% of trade, India has been steadily increasing its presence in the region. In the last year, it experienced a 40% trade growth, and now account for 3% of total trade. In particular, India's main ASEAN trade partners are Singapore, Indonesia, and Malaysia respectively, which alone accounts for almost 70% of its trade with the association. These are also the countries that directly border the Malacca Strait, and Indonesia and Malaysia also face the Andaman Sea. By establishing close ties with these 3 countries, India can create a network of countries that have a direct interest in the Malacca Strait, pushing its political influence towards Southeast Asia and the Pacific, while counterbalancing Chinese influence. Despite the strategic importance of India's islands, they can do little without the necessary maritime capabilities. India's navy has faced budgetary issues for a long time, and border disputes with China and Pakistan have been a major drain on the country's financial resources. In 2021, the Indian Army consumed around 55% of the defense budget, followed by the Air Force at 22%, and the Navy at 15%. In comparison, the United States allocates 23% of its defense budget to the Army, 28% to the Air Force, and 30% to the Navy, with the remaining 18% spread across other services. Since the late 1990s, India has been making a concerted effort to transform its navy from a brown and blue water force driven by the vision of former Prime Ministers Atal Bihari Vajpayee and Manmohan Singh, as well as former Admiral Arun Prakash. However, India must re-evaluate its maritime strategy in order to fully realize its potential in the region. This means investing in the fleet and the necessary logistical infrastructure to support it. But most importantly, Mahan's words are a reminder of how potentially influential New Delhis can be in the region. Thank you so much for watching, and hope to see you at the next one.